They told her it would be simple. Show up to a few events, smile for the cameras, hold his hand in public and walk away with enough money to change her life forever. No strings attached. No feelings involved. Just 30 days of pretending to love a man she'd never met, and then disappear like it never happened. But nobody warned Sarah Mitchell about one critical detail. Nobody told her that the man she was hired to deceive, the cold, calculated crime boss everyone called untouchable, was the kind of man who didn't believe in love because he'd spent his entire life making sure his heart never became a weakness. At 38 years old, after 6 different specialists and a dozen humiliating tests, the verdict came back the same every time. Sterile, permanent, irreversible. No amount of money, no amount of power could change that. And for a man who built his entire life on control, that single word felt like a death sentence. Then, on a freezing November night in 2019, everything Michael thought he knew about his life shattered in the span of 30 seconds. He was standing in the lobby of St. Catherine's Hospital, flanked by 2 of his most trusted men, waiting to visit an associate who'd been shot during a territorial dispute. The lobby was quiet, sterile, filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of antiseptic. And that's when she appeared. A little girl no older than 6, barefoot, her hospital gown hanging off one shoulder, her dark curly hair wild and tangled. She wasn't walking. She was running. Sprinting actually, like her life depended on it. Michael's men immediately stepped forward, hands moving instinctively toward their concealed weapons, but the girl didn't stop. She didn't even hesitate. She ran straight past the security guard, straight past the nurses calling after her, and launched herself directly into Michael's arms, wrapping her tiny hands around his neck and burying her face in his chest. And then she said the words that would change everything. "Daddy, I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't leave me." Michael froze. His entire body went rigid. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing added up. His men exchanged confused glances, unsure whether to pull the child away or wait for orders. The girl was trembling, her small body shaking with sobs, and she clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Michael looked down at her face, and that's when his heart stopped. Because even through the tears, even through the terror in her eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. She looked exactly like someone he'd buried 15 years ago. Michael's first instinct wasn't tenderness. It was suspicion. Because in his world, nothing was ever what it seemed. A child showing up out of nowhere, calling him daddy, looking like a ghost from his past? That wasn't a miracle. That was a setup. A trap. Maybe even a bomb strapped to innocence. He gently but firmly gripped the girl's shoulders and held her at arm's length, studying her face. His voice was calm, controlled, the same tone he used when interrogating men who owed him money. "What's your name?" The girl sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Sophie," she whispered. Sophie. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Because 15 years ago the only woman Michael Romano had ever loved, a woman named Elena Vasquez, used to say that if they ever had a daughter, she'd want to name her Sophie. But Elena was gone. She disappeared without a trace one night in 2004, leaving behind nothing but questions and a hole in Michael's chest that never fully healed. Michael's second-in-command, a stocky man named Tony, leaned in close and whispered, "Boss, this smells wrong. Kids don't just run up to random guys in hospitals. Someone sent her." Michael nodded slowly, but his eyes never left Sophie's face. "Where's your mother?" he asked. Sophie's lip trembled and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "She told me if the bad men came I should find you. She said you'd keep me safe. She said you're my daddy." Michael's jaw tightened. His mind was spinning. Bad men. Safe. Daddy. None of this made sense. He was about to ask another question when Sophie reached into the pocket of her hospital gown and pulled out something small and silver. A necklace. Michael's breath caught in his throat. It was a lion pendant, delicate and old, hanging from a thin chain. He knew that necklace. He'd given it to Elena on their first anniversary. She'd never taken it off. Not once. Michael's hands were shaking now, something his men had never seen before. He took the necklace from Sophie's palm and held it up to the light. On the back of the pendant, barely visible, were 2 initials carved into the metal. M and E, Michael and Elena. His vision blurred for a second. This wasn't a setup. This was real. But that didn't make it any less impossible. Because Michael Romano was sterile. He couldn't have children. 5 doctors had confirmed it. So how could this little girl, this trembling, terrified child, be his daughter? The questions came flooding in like a tidal wave. Who was this child really? How did she know Elena? How did she get that necklace? And most importantly, if Michael was sterile, how could she possibly be his biological daughter? The answers to these questions would unravel a truth so shocking, it would shake the foundation of everything Michael thought he knew about his past. Before Michael Romano became the man who made grown criminals look away when he entered a room, he was just a kid from the south side of Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. His father had been a small-time enforcer for the Irish mob, gunned down in a parking lot when Michael was only 7 years old. Michael remembered the funeral, the closed casket, the way his mother's hands shook when she tried to sign the papers at the funeral home. And he remembered making a promise to himself that day. He would never be powerless again. He would never watch someone he loved suffer because he couldn't protect them. By the time he was 16, Michael was running numbers for local bookies. By 20, he was managing protection rackets. By 25, he'd orchestrated a takeover that left him in control of the entire South Side operation. He wasn't the loudest guy in the room. He wasn't the most violent. But he was the smartest. And in a world where most criminals burned out by 30, Michael Romano built an empire that lasted decades. But success came at a cost. Michael had seen friends betrayed, allies murdered, and innocent people caught in crossfire. He'd become numb to it all, treating violence like paperwork, something necessary but not personal. The only time Michael ever let his guard down, the only time he ever let himself feel something real, was when he met Elena Vasquez. She was a trauma nurse at the hospital where one of his men had been taken after a shooting. Michael went to check on him, and there she was, standing in the hallway with blood on her scrubs and exhaustion in her eyes, but still managing to smile at a frightened kid waiting for news about his father. Michael had never believed in love at first sight. He thought it was something weak men used as an excuse for bad decisions. But when Elena looked at him, really looked at him, not with fear or calculation but with genuine curiosity, something in his chest cracked open. They started talking. Coffee turned into dinners. Dinners turned into late-night conversations about everything and nothing. And 6 months later, Michael did something he swore he'd never do. He fell in love. Elena knew what he was. She wasn't naive. But she saw something in him that no one else did. She saw the kid who'd lost his father. The man who took care of his aging mother. The guy who paid for his crew's kids to go to good schools. She didn't excuse the violence, but she believed he could be more than what the streets had made him. They got married quietly in a small church on the outskirts of the city. No big wedding. No press. Just vows whispered between 2 people who'd found something rare in a world built on lies. And for a while Michael was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy. They talked about starting a family. About maybe getting out of the life someday, moving somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. Elena wanted kids. She wanted a house with a yard and Sunday dinners and all the normal things that seemed impossible for someone like Michael. So they tried. For 2 years they tried. And nothing happened. That's when they went to the doctors. Test after test after test. And finally the diagnosis came back. Michael was sterile. The doctors explained it was likely due to a childhood illness he'd barely remembered, something that had damaged him permanently. There was no treatment. No surgery. No miracle cure. Elena didn't blame him. She never said it out loud, but Michael could see it in her eyes. The grief. The loss of a future they'd both imagined. He promised her they'd adopt. He promised they'd find another way. But something changed between them after that. Not anger. Not resentment. Just a quiet sadness that settled into their home like fog. Elena started working longer shifts at the hospital. Michael threw himself deeper into business. And slowly, without either of them meaning to, they started drifting apart. Then one night in October 2004, Michael came home to an empty apartment. No note. No goodbye. Just gone. Elena had disappeared, taking almost nothing with her. Just some clothes, some cash, and the lion necklace he'd given her. Michael searched for her. He called in every favor, hired private investigators, leaned on people who owed him. But Elena Vasquez had vanished like smoke. And after 6 months of dead ends, Michael accepted what he thought was the truth. She'd left him because she couldn't live with a man who couldn't give her children. She'd left because the life he offered wasn't enough. He buried that pain deep, locked it away, and went back to being the man everyone feared. For 15 years, Michael Romano lived like a machine. Efficient, cold, untouchable. He built his empire higher, his walls thicker, and convinced himself that he didn't need anyone, that he was better off alone. And then a 6-year-old girl ran into his arms calling him daddy, and every lie he'd told himself for 15 years shattered in an instant. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. He was about to speak when the sound of shattering glass erupted from the far end of the lobby. Gunfire. Screams. Chaos. People dove to the floor as masked men stormed through the entrance, automatic weapons raised. And Michael realized with horrifying clarity that they weren't here for him. They were here for Sophie. Michael didn't think. He acted. Years of survival instinct took over. He scooped Sophie into his arms, shielding her body with his own, and bolted toward the nearest exit. Tony and the other guard returned fire, buying him precious seconds. Bullets tore through the walls, shattered windows, sent chunks of plaster raining down. Sophie screamed, burying her face in Michael's shoulder, and he whispered the only thing he could think of. "I've got you. I won't let them hurt you." He didn't know if he was lying. He didn't know if he could protect her. But in that moment, it was the only truth that mattered. They made it to the stairwell and Michael took the steps 2 at a time, his heart pounding, his mind racing. Who were those men? Who sent them? And how did they know Sophie would be here? The gunmen moved with precision, not like street thugs but like trained professionals. That told Michael everything he needed to know. This wasn't a random attack. This was a hit. Someone had sent a kill team after a 6-year-old girl. And that meant Sophie wasn't just in danger. She was a target. Someone wanted her dead badly enough to launch an assault in a public hospital in broad daylight. Michael's car was parked 2 blocks away. He couldn't risk going back to get it. Instead, he flagged down a taxi, practically threw Sophie into the back seat, and barked an address to a confused driver who looked like he wanted to ask questions but wisely kept his mouth shut. 20 minutes later, Michael was in a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a small, nondescript apartment above a bakery that he kept off the books for emergencies exactly like this. Sophie sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide and glassy with shock. She hadn't spoken since they'd escaped the hospital. She just stared at the wall, her small hands clutching the lion necklace like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. Michael paced the room, phone pressed to his ear, calling in every favor he had. He needed answers. Fast. He needed to know if Sophie was really his daughter. And if she was, he needed to know how that was even possible. His private doctor, a man named Dr. Alan Brenner, arrived within the hour, carrying a medical kit and a portable DNA testing device. Michael had paid Dr. Brenner enough over the years to ensure absolute discretion. The doctor never asked questions, never judged, and never talked. "I need a paternity test," Michael said, his voice flat. "Tonight." Dr. Brenner didn't hesitate. He just nodded, swabbed Sophie's cheek gently, swabbed Michael's, and promised results within 6 hours. While they waited, Michael sat across from Sophie and tried to get her to talk. His voice was softer now, gentler than his men had ever heard it. "Sophie, I need you to tell me everything you remember. Can you do that for me?" Sophie nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. She spoke in fragments, her words broken by hiccups and tears, but the story she told was enough to make Michael's blood boil. Sophie said her mother's name was Elena. They'd been living under fake names for as long as Sophie could remember, moving every few months, always hiding, always running. Sophie didn't know why. She just knew her mom was scared. They never stayed in one place long enough for Sophie to make real friends. They never celebrated birthdays in public. Elena homeschooled her, kept her away from cameras, taught her to never tell anyone her real name. 3 days ago, Elena got a phone call. Sophie didn't hear the whole conversation, but she saw her mother's face go white, saw her hands start shaking. That night, Elena packed a small bag, knelt down in front of Sophie, and told her something that sounded like a goodbye. "If anything happens to me, you need to find a man named Michael Romano. He's in the city. He's important. People know him. You find him and you tell him you're his daughter. No matter what anyone tells you, he's your father and he'll protect you." The next morning, Sophie woke up alone in their apartment. Elena was gone. Just gone. Sophie waited all day thinking maybe her mom had just gone to the store, but Elena never came back. Then that evening men came. Men with guns and hard faces. They kicked in the door, started tearing the apartment apart, looking for something. Sophie hid in the closet, her heart pounding so hard she thought they'd hear it. She heard them talking, heard one of them say, "The kid's gotta be here somewhere. Find her." That's when Sophie remembered what her mother had told her. She waited until the men were in the other room, then she slipped out through the bedroom window, climbed down the fire escape and ran. She ran for blocks, her bare feet slapping against cold pavement, until she saw the hospital. She'd hidden there for hours, too scared to talk to anyone, too scared to move. And then she saw Michael walk through the lobby. She didn't know how she recognized him. Her mother had never shown her a picture. But somehow, some instinct deeper than logic told her that was him. That was her father. So she ran. Michael listened to every word, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Elena had been alive all these years. Hiding. Running. Protecting their daughter from something so dangerous she'd rather disappear than face it. But from who? And why? And where was she now? Michael had a sickening feeling he already knew the answer to that last question. If Elena had sent Sophie to find him, if she'd given her that necklace and those instructions, it meant Elena knew she wasn't coming back. It meant she'd sacrificed herself to give Sophie a chance to survive. The thought of it, the image of Elena alone and afraid, making one last desperate move to save their child, nearly broke him. But Michael didn't have time to grieve. Not yet. Because Sophie was still in danger. And he needed to know who was hunting her. While they waited for the DNA results, Michael made calls. Quiet calls to people who owed him. People who heard things. People who knew things. Within 2 hours he had a name. Vincent Callahan. A former associate, someone Michael had worked with years ago before their paths diverged. Vincent had always been ambitious, always hungry for more power, more territory, more respect. Michael had kept him at arm's length, never fully trusting him, and eventually they'd gone their separate ways. But Vincent had never forgotten. He'd spent the last decade quietly building his own operation, waiting for the right moment to take what he believed should have been his. And when Vincent learned that Michael had a daughter, a biological heir, he saw it as a threat. Because as long as Sophie existed, Michael's legacy couldn't be erased. Vincent wanted Michael's empire. And to get it, he needed to make sure there was no one left to inherit it. Michael's phone buzzed. It was Dr. Brenner. Michael stepped into the hallway and answered, his heart pounding. Tell me. There was a pause on the other end, a pause that felt like it lasted forever. Then Dr. Brenner's voice, quiet and careful. She's yours, Michael. 99.9% match. Sophie is your biological daughter. Michael's knees almost buckled. He leaned against the wall, trying to process what he'd just heard. His hand gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. That's not possible, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sterile. You told me yourself 15 years ago. Dr. Brenner sighed, and Michael could hear the rustle of papers on the other end. I know. But there's something else. I pulled some old medical records, called in a favor at a fertility clinic in Boston. 15 years ago, Elena Vasquez underwent an in vitro fertilization procedure at that clinic. She used a frozen embryo. Your sperm was collected and stored years before you were diagnosed as sterile, probably during some routine physical or medical exam. The records show she never told you. She did this entirely in secret. Michael's mind reeled. Elena had done this without telling him. She'd created a child, their child, and then disappeared, keeping Sophie hidden from him, from the world, for 6 years. But why? What was she protecting Sophie from? Dr. Brenner's voice broke through his thoughts again, and this time there was tension in it, something that sounded like fear. Michael, there's one more thing. Someone accessed those medical records 3 weeks ago. Someone outside the clinic, someone who bypassed their security. I don't know who, but they know Sophie exists. They know she's yours. And they know where that clinic is. Michael's entire body went cold. Someone had been tracking Elena. Tracking Sophie. Hunting them. And now they were trying to erase the evidence. His daughter wasn't just in danger. She was a target for someone who had the resources, the intelligence, and the ruthlessness to track down a woman who'd been hiding for 15 years. The men who'd attacked the hospital weren't street-level thugs. They were professionals. Kill teams. And that meant someone powerful, someone with serious reach, wanted Sophie dead. Michael went back into the apartment and looked at Sophie, who was curled up on the couch, half asleep, clutching the lion necklace like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. For the first time in 23 years, Michael Romano felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Fear. Not for himself. For her. And that fear ignited something else. Something sharper. More dangerous. Because a man with nothing to lose is terrifying. But a man with something to protect? He becomes a force of nature. Michael made a decision right there. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide Sophie away in some remote location and hope the problem solved itself. He was going to find out who was hunting his daughter. And he was going to end them. Permanently. But first he needed to keep Sophie safe. He needed time to work, to investigate, to plan. So he called Tony and 3 other men he trusted with his life, men who'd been with him since the beginning, and he told them to set up a secure perimeter around the safe house. No one in or out without his permission. Then he started pulling threads. The next 72 hours were a blur of calls, meetings, and quiet threats whispered in backrooms across the city. Michael pulled every string he had, leaned on every contact, squeezed every informant until the pieces started coming together. And what he found made his blood run colder than he ever thought possible. Vincent Callahan had been watching Michael for years, waiting for a weakness, waiting for an opening. When Vincent's people discovered that Elena Vasquez had accessed that fertility clinic 15 years ago, they started tracking her. It took them years, but they eventually found her living under a fake name in a small town outside Boston. They'd been surveilling her for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Elena had somehow sensed it. That phone call Sophie mentioned, the one that made her mother's face go white, that was Elena's contact inside Vincent's organization warning her that they were coming. Elena had maybe 6 hours. So she made a choice. She sent Sophie away, gave her the necklace and the instructions, and stayed behind to buy her daughter time to escape. Michael's investigators found Elena's body 3 days after Sophie ran into his arms. She'd been killed in a warehouse outside Boston, shot twice in the chest. The police had listed her as a Jane Doe, no identification, no next of kin. But Michael knew. He knew Elena had died protecting their daughter. She'd faced down armed men, refused to give up Sophie's location, and paid for that defiance with her life. When Michael heard the news, he sat alone in his office and felt something break inside him. Not just grief. Not just rage. Something deeper. A recognition that Elena had loved Sophie more than anything in the world, enough to sacrifice everything, and he'd spent 15 years thinking she'd abandoned him. The truth was so much worse and so much better than he'd imagined. Elena hadn't left because she stopped loving him. She'd left because she loved their daughter too much to raise her in Michael's world. A world of violence and blood and enemies who'd use a child as leverage. Elena had tried to give Sophie a normal life. And she died trying to keep that promise. But Vincent had made a critical mistake. He'd underestimated what Michael would do to protect his daughter. Vincent thought fear would paralyze Michael, thought the threat to Sophie would make him weak, make him negotiate. Vincent didn't understand that taking away Michael's daughter wasn't just an attack. It was a declaration of war. And Michael Romano had spent 23 years learning how to win wars. He didn't go after Vincent directly. That would have been too obvious, too messy. Instead, Michael did what he did best. He dismantled Vincent's operation piece by piece. He started with the money. Michael had connections in every major bank in the city, relationships built over decades of carefully placed bribes and favors. Within a week, he'd frozen Vincent's assets, seized his accounts and cut off his cash flow. Then he went after Vincent's suppliers. The people who provided guns, drugs and other merchandise that kept Vincent's empire running. Michael visited each one personally, made them offers they couldn't refuse, and within 2 weeks, Vincent's supply chain had collapsed. Then Michael turned to Vincent's allies. The politicians, the judges, the police officers who'd been taking Vincent's money and looking the other way. Michael had dirt on all of them, files and recordings he'd been collecting for years as insurance. He leaked just enough to the right people, federal investigators who'd been looking for an excuse to take down corrupt officials, and suddenly Vincent's protection evaporated. One by one, the people who'd been shielding Vincent from prosecution either flipped or disappeared. And through it all, Michael never raised his voice. Never lost his temper. He just moved through the city like a ghost, dismantling everything Vincent had built with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Within 4 weeks, Vincent Callahan went from running a multi-million-dollar operation to hiding in a rundown motel on the edge of town, paranoid and isolated. That's when Michael made his final move. He didn't kill Vincent. He didn't need to. Instead, he arranged for Vincent to be arrested by federal agents on charges of racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and about a dozen other felonies that would put him away for life. The morning Vincent was arrested, Michael stood across the street and watched as federal agents dragged him out of that motel in handcuffs. Vincent saw Michael standing there, saw the cold satisfaction in his eyes, and for the first time in his life, Vincent Callahan understood what it meant to truly lose. Michael didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just watched. Because this wasn't about revenge. This was about making sure Sophie would never have to look over her shoulder again. That night, Michael went back to the safe house and told Sophie that the bad men were gone. That she was safe now. Sophie looked up at him with those big dark eyes, so much like Elena's, and asked the question that nearly broke him. Is my mom coming back? Michael knelt down so he was at her eye level, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, he let himself be honest. Not the cold, calculated honesty of a criminal. The raw, painful honesty of a father. No, sweetheart. She's not. But she loved you more than anything in the world. And she made sure you'd be safe. That's why she sent you to me. Sophie's face crumpled and she started crying, these deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Michael pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried, and he realized he was crying too. Not the quiet, controlled tears of a man trying to maintain composure. Real tears. The kind that came from a place he'd kept locked away for decades. They sat there on the floor of that safe house, two people who'd lost the same woman in different ways, holding on to each other like they were the only solid thing in a world that had fallen apart. And in that moment, Michael Romano stopped being the feared crime boss who'd ruled the city for 23 years. He became something else. Something harder and more important. He became a father. The weeks that followed were some of the strangest of Michael's life. He'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of people, moving millions of dollars, orchestrating operations that required perfect timing and absolute ruthlessness. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the challenge of taking care of a traumatized 6-year-old girl. Sophie had nightmares almost every night. She'd wake up screaming, convinced the bad men were back, convinced they were coming for her. Michael would rush into her room, turn on the lights, and sit with her until she fell back asleep. Sometimes that took hours. He learned to keep a night light on. Learned to leave her bedroom door cracked open so she could see the light from the hallway. Learned to check under the bed and in the closet, not because he thought there was actually danger but because Sophie needed to see him do it. She needed the reassurance that he was protecting her, that he was watching, that she wasn't alone. During the day, Sophie was quieter than most kids her age. She didn't laugh much. Didn't play. She'd just sit on the couch, holding that lion necklace, staring out the window like she was waiting for her mother to walk through the door. Michael tried everything he could think of to help her. He bought her toys, books, art supplies. He hired a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. He made her favorite foods, things she mentioned her mother used to make. But nothing seemed to reach her. She was polite, obedient even, but there was a wall between them, a distance that no amount of effort seemed to close. And Michael understood why. Because he was a stranger. Yes, he was her biological father. Yes, the DNA test proved it. But Sophie didn't know him. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after Sophie came into his life, Michael was sitting in the kitchen going through paperwork when he heard a sound he hadn't heard since she'd arrived. Laughter. Quiet, hesitant, but unmistakably laughter. He walked into the living room and saw Sophie sitting on the floor, playing with a stray cat that had somehow gotten into the apartment. The cat was batting at a piece of string and Sophie was giggling, her face lit up in a way he hadn't seen before. Michael stood there watching, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. And then Sophie looked up and saw him, and for just a second her smile faltered, like she'd been caught doing something wrong. But Michael smiled back, a real smile, and said, "You like cats?" Sophie nodded. "My mom said we couldn't have pets because we moved too much. But I always wanted one." Michael looked at the cat, a scruffy orange tabby with a torn ear and a crooked tail, and made a decision. "Then I guess we're keeping this one." Sophie's eyes went wide. "Really? Really?" Michael said. And just like that they had a cat. It was a small thing, insignificant in the grand scheme of everything that had happened. But it was the first crack in the wall between them. Sophie named the cat Leo, after the lion on her necklace, and suddenly the apartment felt a little less empty. Sophie started talking more, asking questions about Michael's day, telling him stories about things she remembered with her mother. And slowly, carefully, Michael started opening up too. He told her about his own childhood, about losing his father, about the promise he'd made to never be powerless again. He didn't hide what he'd done, didn't pretend to be someone he wasn't. But he also didn't burden her with details she was too young to understand. He just tried to be honest. And somewhere in those conversations, in the quiet moments between a man and a little girl learning how to be a family, Michael realized something that shocked him. He was happy. Not the hollow, temporary satisfaction he used to get from closing a deal or winning a territory dispute. Real happiness. The kind that came from watching Sophie play with Leo. The kind that came from hearing her laugh at a dumb joke he'd told. The kind that came from tucking her in at night and hearing her say, "Good night, Dad," instead of "Good night, Michael." But the past has a way of catching up no matter how hard you try to outrun it. 3 months after Vincent's arrest, Michael got a call from one of his attorneys. Vincent was trying to cut a deal with federal prosecutors. He was offering to testify against Michael, to give up names, dates, details of operations going back 20 years. If Vincent's testimony was credible, if prosecutors believed they could use it to build a case, Michael was looking at serious prison time. Maybe even life. Michael's first instinct was to handle it the way he'd always handled problems. Quietly. Permanently. Vincent was in a federal holding facility, but Michael had connections. He could get to him. One word, one phone call, and Vincent would never testify against anyone. But then Michael looked at Sophie, who was sitting at the kitchen table doing a math worksheet, her tongue poking out in concentration the way Elena's used to, and he realized he couldn't do it. Not anymore. Because if he went down that road, if he solved problems the old way, he'd be right back where he started. A man living in darkness. A man Sophie would eventually learn to fear instead of love. So Michael made a different choice. He called his lawyers and told them to prepare for trial. If Vincent wanted to testify, let him. Michael would face the consequences of his past instead of running from them. The legal battle stretched on for months. Michael was indicted on multiple charges: racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering. The media had a field day. The man who'd ruled the city's underworld for 2 decades was finally being brought to justice. Michael's face was on every news channel, every newspaper. And through it all, Sophie watched. Michael sat her down one night and tried to explain. Everything they're saying about me, most of it's true. I've done things I'm not proud of. I've hurt people. I've made choices I can't take back. But I need you to understand something, Sophie. The man I was before I met you, that's not the man I want to be anymore. You changed me. Your mother changed me. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of man you can be proud of, even if that means facing the consequences of who I used to be. Sophie looked at him with those serious, dark eyes, and then she said something that made Michael's chest tighten. My mom used to say that people can change if they really want to. She said everyone deserves a second chance. Michael felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Your mom was a smart woman. Sophie nodded. She said you were a good man who forgot how to be good. But I don't think you forgot. I think you just needed someone to remember with. And in that moment, Michael understood what Elena had been trying to do all those years. She hadn't left because she stopped believing in him. She'd left because she believed in him too much. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Vincent testified just like he'd promised. He laid out every detail of Michael's operation, every crime, every dirty deal. The prosecutors built a case that should have been airtight. But Michael's lawyers were good. More than good. They poked holes in Vincent's testimony, pointed out inconsistencies, highlighted the fact that Vincent was a convicted felon trying to reduce his own sentence by implicating others. They argued that much of the evidence was circumstantial, that Vincent's word alone wasn't enough to convict. And in the end, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury came back with a split verdict. Guilty on some of the lesser charges, money laundering and tax evasion, but not guilty on the major ones, racketeering and conspiracy. Michael was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 3. The night before he was scheduled to turn himself in, Michael sat with Sophie in the living room of a small house he'd bought in the suburbs, a house far away from the city, far away from the life he used to lead. They'd moved there 2 months ago, after it became clear the trial wasn't going his way. He'd arranged for her to live with his cousin Maria, a woman who'd left the old neighborhood years ago and built a quiet life as a schoolteacher. Maria had 3 kids of her own, and she'd agreed to take Sophie in, to raise her as part of the family. Michael had made sure of that. He'd set up a trust fund, enough money to cover Sophie's education, her needs, everything she'd require until she was an adult. He'd signed over all his legitimate assets, the few businesses he'd managed to keep clean, to make sure she'd be taken care of. Michael served 3 years and 4 months. He kept his head down, stayed out of trouble, and spent every spare moment writing letters to Sophie. Long letters about what he was reading, what he was thinking, what he remembered about Elena. Sophie wrote back, telling him about school, about her new friends, about how Leo had learned to open doors and was constantly getting into trouble. Her letters were the only thing that kept Michael sane during those years. The only reminder that there was something worth coming back to. When he was finally released on parole, Maria and Sophie were waiting outside the prison gates. Sophie was 11 now, taller, her face showing hints of the young woman she'd become. But when she saw Michael, she ran to him the same way she had that night in the hospital, throwing her arms around him like she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. Michael hugged her back, tears streaming down his face, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he could breathe again. They didn't go back to the city. Michael had made that decision long before his release. Instead, he moved to the same quiet suburb where Maria lived, bought a small house 2 streets over, and started building a different kind of life. He got a job working construction, manual labor that kept his hands busy and his mind clear. He went to Sophie's soccer games, helped her with homework, showed up at parent-teacher conferences like any other dad. He followed the rules of his parole to the letter, checked in with his officer every week, stayed away from anyone connected to his old life. And slowly, painfully, he learned how to be normal. Years passed. Sophie graduated high school with honors, got accepted to college on a partial scholarship. Michael cried the day he dropped her off at her dorm, not because he was sad, but because he was so damn proud he couldn't contain it. She was studying social work, planning to help kids who'd been through situations like hers. And Michael knew without a doubt that Elena would have been proud too. On Sophie's 21st birthday, Michael gave her a small box. Inside was the lion necklace, the one she'd carried that night in the hospital, the one Elena had worn every day of their marriage. Sophie opened the box and stared at it for a long moment, tears welling in her eyes. "I want you to have it," Michael said. "Your mother gave it to you for a reason. To keep you safe. To remind you where you came from." Sophie put the necklace on, and Michael saw Elena looking back at him through his daughter's eyes. "Thank you, Dad," she said. "For everything. For choosing me over that life. For being here." Michael shook his head. "You've got it backwards, sweetheart. You chose me." Michael shook his head. "You've got it backwards, sweetheart. You chose me. You ran into the arms of a stranger and called him Daddy, and somehow, impossibly, you saved me. I spent 23 years building an empire that didn't matter. And then you showed up and gave me something worth protecting. You gave me a reason to be better." They sat together for a while, not saying much, just being present. And Michael thought about all the choices that had led him to this moment. The violence, the mistakes, the years of darkness. But also the love. Elena's sacrifice. Sophie's forgiveness. The second chance he never thought he deserved. And he realized that legacy isn't built on power or fear or how many people remember your name when you're gone. Legacy is built on the people you love. The people you protect. The people who carry pieces of you forward into the world long after you're gone. Michael Romano had spent most of his life being a monster in a suit, a man people feared and avoided. But in the end, the only thing that mattered was that he'd been a father to a little girl who needed him. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. So here's what I want to ask you. If you were in Michael's position, and a child you didn't know existed suddenly appeared in your life, would you have believed her? Would you have protected her, even knowing it would cost you everything? Or would you have walked away, convinced it was a trap or a con? And do you think people can really change? Can someone who's lived in darkness for decades truly step into the light and become someone different? Or is redemption just a story we tell ourselves to feel better about the things we've done? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. But they're worth thinking about. Because stories like this, stories about impossible choices and second chances, they don't just entertain us. They force us to examine our own lives, our own decisions. They make us ask what we would do if we were the ones standing in that hospital lobby. If a stranger called us family and looked at us like they were their last hope in the world. Would we have the courage to rise to the occasion? Or would we walk away because it's safer, easier, less complicated? I think about Michael sometimes, about the choice he made. He could have handed Sophie off to social services. He could have convinced himself it wasn't his problem, that he'd done his DNA test and his legal obligation was fulfilled. He could have gone back to his empire, his power, his comfortable numbness. But he didn't. He chose the harder path. The uncertain path. The path that required him to be vulnerable, to be present, to be human. And in doing so, he found something he'd been searching for his entire life without even knowing it. Purpose. Not the kind that comes from power or money. The kind that comes from being needed by someone who has no reason to need you except that they do. The kind that comes from loving someone more than you love yourself. The kind that makes you want to be better than you are. And I think that's what Elena understood all those years ago when she made the impossible decision to leave. She understood that Michael had goodness in him, buried deep under layers of survival and violence and fear. She understood that if he ever had a daughter, if he ever had someone who depended on him not for protection from enemies, but for love, for guidance, for presence, he would find his way back to the man he was supposed to be. So what about you? Have you ever been given a second chance? Have you ever had someone look at you and see potential you didn't see in yourself? Have you ever had to choose between the life you built and the life you were meant to live? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me your story. Tell me if this resonated with you. If it made you think differently about redemption or family or the possibility of change. Because that's what these stories are for. Not just to entertain, but to connect us. To remind us that we're all struggling with the same fundamental questions about who we are and who we want to be. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, something that stayed with you even after the video ended, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Because the next story is even more unexpected. even more emotional. And it starts with a wedding ring found inside a coffin that was supposed to be empty. A mystery that will make you question everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and the secrets we keep from the people we trust most. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the most important thing we can do is show up for the people who need us. Even when we don't know how. Even when we're scared. Even when the world tells us we're not enough. Because the truth is, love isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. And that's a lesson worth remembering.